The night air reeked of desperation and fear. Fires burned low in the king's camp, casting flickering shadows across the ragged tents and weary faces of men who had seen too many days of bloodshed. King Matthias paced within his command tent, his once proud posture hunched beneath the weight of his kingdom's impending fall. They were outnumbered, surrounded on all sides by enemies whose blades hungered for the taste of his people's blood. The king's eyes flicked nervously to the old man crouched by the hearth, his robes tattered and stained with the dust of ancient graves. The king's voice trembled as he spoke. "Are you certain this will work, Magister?" The old man, his voice a rasp that seemed to drag through the ages, did not look up from the parchment in his hands. "There are no certainties when dealing with forces of the abyss, Your Grace. But there are ancient powers, forgotten by most, that can be called upon. If you wish to defeat your enemies, you must be willing to pay the price." Matthias clenched his jaw. He had already paid dearly. Hundreds of his men lay rotting in the fields beyond, their blood soaking into the earth that had once been his kingdom's fertile heart. His kingdom was crumbling, his throne a brittle husk. What was one more price to pay, even if it demanded his soul? "Do it," he commanded, his voice steeled by the last vestiges of his fading courage. The Magister nodded slowly and began the incantation. The air within the tent grew thick, oppressive. The flames in the hearth flickered wildly before sputtering out, plunging the room into darkness. Only the sound of the Magister's whispered words remained, ancient syllables twisting unnaturally upon his tongue. Shadows slithered from the corners of the tent, coalescing into a single, blackened mass that seemed to devour the very light around it. And from that darkness, he emerged. Lord Valen stepped forth as if materializing from the night itself, his presence commanding and terrible. He wore armor, a suit of blackened steel etched with intricate, arcane symbols that seemed to pulse with an eerie, internal light. His pauldrons were sharp, angular, almost like wings crafted from metal, and his chestplate bore the sigil of an ancient house long forgotten by mortal men. The armor clung to his towering frame, more a second skin than mere protection, giving him the appearance of a warlord born of nightmares. His eyes, deep blood red and glowing faintly in the gloom, contrasted sharply with his cold, pale skin. He was tall, imposing, with a face that bore the cruel elegance of a predator. Long, raven-black hair cascaded down his shoulders, spilling over the edges of his armored collar like a dark waterfall. King Matthias stumbled back, choking on fear. He had summoned death itself. The vampire lord's gaze flicked lazily around the tent, taking in the trembling king, the kneeling magister, and the faint odor of blood lingering on the air. He exhaled, a sound like the softest sigh of amusement. "You," Valen's voice was a silken purr, dangerously soft, "dared to summon me?" The magister's voice faltered, words dying on his lips as he slowly lifted his gaze to meet the vampire lord's. His withered face was drawn tight with dread. My lord, we—" "Silence," Valen interrupted, his voice carrying the weight of centuries. His eyes, those terrible red orbs, fixed upon the king. "You believe yourself in need of my power?" King Matthias gathered what little resolve he had left, straightening his spine. "I am your summoner. You will obey me." The words had barely left his mouth before Valen moved. He was upon the king in an instant, faster than a shadow's shift beneath the moon. His gauntleted hand shot out, grasping Matthias by the throat with effortless strength. The king gasped, his eyes wide with terror as Valen lifted him off the ground as if he weighed nothing more than a sack of grain. "I obey no one," Valen whispered, his voice dripping with venom. He leaned in close, his lips pulling back to reveal sharp, glistening fangs. "You think to command me? You, a pitiful mortal who can scarcely comprehend the eternity of night?" Matthias's breaths became shallow, panicked. His heart thundered in his chest, each beat a drum roll to his inevitable demise. He tried to plead, to reason, but the words caught in his throat, drowned beneath the crushing force of Valen's grip. The vampire lord's smile was cold as winter's kiss. He tilted the king's head to one side, exposing the vulnerable curve of his neck. Without hesitation, he sank his fangs into the flesh. The king's scream stifled, as blood flowed freely into the maw of the ancient being. The tent filled with the wet sounds of feeding, and within moments, the king's body went limp. Valen discarded him as one would discard a drained goblet, tossing him carelessly to the floor. The Magister, who had remained frozen in horror, took a staggering step back, his ancient bones trembling violently. My lord, he stammered. Please. Mercy. Valen's gaze snapped to him, and the old man fell silent, his breath hitching in his throat. Valen licked the blood from his lips, savoring the taste. Mercy, he mused, as though the word were foreign to him. Such a quaint notion. Do you know how long it has been since I last showed mercy, Magister? The old man whimpered, shaking his head. Valen took a slow step forward, the plates of his armor clinking faintly with the movement. He loomed over the frail figure. His smile widened, but there was no warmth in it, only hunger. Then allow me to teach you. The lesson is final. With a sudden blur of motion, Valen's armored hand plunged into the Magister's chest, fingers curling around his heart. The Magister gasped, his eyes bulging as the vampire lord ripped the still-beating organ from his chest. The Magister crumpled to the ground, lifeless, as Valen inspected the heart with detached interest before crushing it in his grasp. Outside, the camp was in chaos. Soldiers had seen the darkness descend upon the tent, had heard the cries of their king and Magister, but no one dared approach. Valen emerged from the tent like a wraith, his bloodied hands gleaming in the moonlight. He surveyed the camp with a dispassionate gaze. The scent of fear thickened the air. He could hear the hurried whispers, the prayers muttered to distant gods, but none of them mattered. I do not fight for kings, Valen declared, his voice carrying across the camp. I do not serve men. I am Lord Valen, born of night and blood, and all who defy me will meet the same fate as your king. The soldiers readied themselves, staring at him with a mixture of awe and terror. Valen's lip curled into a sneer. Mortals were such fragile, predictable things. He took a step forward, then another, moving through the camp like a specter. And wherever he passed, death followed. Silent, swift, and unforgiving. He slaughtered them with the grace of a dancer, each movement precise, deliberate. Blood soaked the earth, bodies fell like broken dolls, and Valen never once hesitated. By dawn, the camp was silent. The once proud banners of the kingdom lay tattered and stained in the mud, and the corpses of the king's army sprawled lifeless across the ground. Valen stood amidst the carnage, alone, a dark silhouette against the rising sun. The vampire lord wiped the blood from his armored gauntlets, his eyes scanning the horizon. There were no enemies left to fight, no battles to be won. But he had been awakened, and the world would soon remember the name of Lord Valen, a name that would echo through the centuries, whispered in fear and reverence. For he was no longer bound by the will of men. He was free, and the night was his kingdom. And in that kingdom, there would be no mercy.